Hi, class. I'm having to. I think I mentioned on the recent upload of your exam instructions, I had issues with processing this video from my laptop. So I'm doing it from my office computer. So I hope it will be helpful. And I'm assuming most of you, probably just getting started on this project. So and in while it was messed up in giving you these detailed instructions, I'm basically just going to kind of walk through the instructions that I gave you for the exam, and I think they were pretty explanatory. So, to give you kind of the vision of this exam, this project, the real thrust of it is I want you to get to, if we're thinking about changing the world, hence the name of the book, that one of the books I had you read. I really want you to think about changing the world within your sphere of influence. We live in a culture that kind of trains us to think about the changes that need to be made everywhere except the particular world that we inhabit. And I mean not just the world in general that we inhabit, or just even the sphere that we inhabit. I mean the body, the mind, the soul, the relationships, the networks, and then from that the sphere that we inhabit. So it's a way of viewing change, cultural change, that begins with the assumption that the way culture changes is when I begin to take responsibility. Stop complaining about and stop complaining about who isn't taking responsibility somewhere out there in some distant world that I hear about from the news media, or that I hear about on Facebook or on the headlines. And there's a time and a place for that. There's a time and a place for political change and cultural change and all of that happening from the top down, and we can contribute to that, and we do that every time we go into a voting booth and a part of a protest or whatever. But when that is the majority of what we think about as cultural change, then what it basically means is that we are powerless and we are conceding power. We are ceding rather power, and that is not the vision of Christ. Where for most of history, the church has advanced through this sense of having some power. Now, sometimes it's been an abuse of power. But at its best, it's been a great use of power. And it's the same power that we were endowed with on the day of Pentecost, the power of the Holy Spirit. Hunter talks about this in his book. The power to bless, the power to proclaim the good news, the power to heal in some cases. We are not powerless. But to access the power of our power, whether it's the power of the Holy Spirit particularly, or just even our self, the power we have as individuals created in the image of God. That begins when we begin taking responsibility for our lives. So, and I'll come back to that at the end of this. So, in the first essay, the goal is basically finding yourself on the map. It is an essay on your particular vantage point. This should be, in one way, easy for you, because it's really just about having a kind of honest introspection, honest reflection about who you are and the particularity of you, the body, mind, and heart that you inhabit. Know who you are. So there's three sections. The first section is that the body, mind, habit. The reason I have you avoid religious or spiritual descriptions here is not because I don't think they belong to the deepest part of who you are. I do, in fact. I think they decisively are the deepest part of who we are, but sometimes not self-consciously so. And I made the conscious decision to separate that to so that you place your religious affiliation, your spirituality, your relationship with God in the second section, because the second section is all about relationships, and so your relationship with God and others ultimately reduces to that, ultimately a relationship, and religious practices and so forth. But so I wanted to get you to avoid the kind of religious language in the first place, and I wanted to help us move away from the temptation to reduce ourselves to religious cliches. Christians are good at that sometimes. So this is a way to begin thinking about the honest relationship we have with ourselves. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative. We're all kind of mixed bag as it relates to that here. But I wanted you to think about the relationship, first of all, that you're an embodied creature. You have a relationship with your body. For some people, it's a good thing. For some people, it's a bad thing. Again, I want to stress here, don't feel that you have to include anything that you're not comfortable sharing. I'm not looking for any information in particular. This exercise is for you. So if there are things that you're not comfortable sharing with me, just make a note of it to yourself, and that's fine. But the point is, say, what is this relationship with your body? Because we are profoundly embodied creatures, and our relationship with our body affects so much of our emotional state, affects so much of our behaviors, our sense of self-confidence, self-awareness, or self-esteem. So it's important to recognize what is your relationship with your body and with your mind, even though your mind is a thing relating to your mind. So that can be kind of confusing. How do you perceive your capability, your capacity as it relates to your mind? Because again, this is something you are constantly, this aspect of you, this self-understanding, self-awareness is something you're constantly engagement with throughout the day, each day. And then your emotional state. Are you moody? Are you up and down? Are your emotions largely based on circumstances? Does that create instability? Or do you have a good level of detachment from circumstances, and you have a steadiness, a resolve of emotion? Just this is a way for you to again begin thinking what is your self-conscious awareness of yourself, the actual self that you inhabit day to day. So that's section 1. Section 2, your relationships. So know who you are, and then know whose you are. And yes, your relationship with God, but we also belong to our relationships with others. First, on relationship with God, the Bible gives us a number of analogies or descriptions of our relationship with God, and using everything from father and child. In fact, Jesus says that we should pray, Our Father, and that's true in light of his sonship. He's the Son of God who makes us children of God. That was unprecedented largely in Israel's history. It's a gospel-based development that in him, through the Spirit, we cry, Abba, Father. So think of Romans 8. And then there's master-servant or master-slave, Lord and disciple. Think about how do you typically relate to God? And as I mentioned in the instructions, this typically will come out in the way that you pray. How do you pray? In fact, just my own history of growing in my faith, for probably 6 or 7 years after I became a Christian, I was not able to pray to God as Father. And I had some serious issues with my dad. He had been a pastor and walked out on his church and on the family when I was in middle school. And I had to realize that so much of my relationship with God had been skewed and scarred by my relationship with my father. And so it took a long time for me to see God as Father. And there was a lot of freedom in that. But I could only pray to Him as Lord. And so, and it's not that that's wrong necessarily. It's just incomplete. And so we need to see, and as it relates to those two titles, we need to see Him both Lord and Father, as Lord and Father. So the question, though, is it in balance? Do you see Him only as Father and not as Lord? So you kind of, my will be done rather than your will be done way of life, or Lord and not as Father, so that he becomes a slave master or taskmaster. He becomes the very Pharaoh that He's trying to rescue you from. Is that in balance? Do you see Him in this, the fullness of the biblical description? And then, yeah, the goal is not to be idealistic, but to be accurately descriptive of your relationship with God. Because again, this is not about you and your relationship with God so much as it is you recognizing the actual vantage point that you stand at every day and inhabit this world. Because all of it influences how you inhabit this world. And then your relationship with others. What are your primary relationships, and what are your primary roles? Roles tend to describe the kind of relationships that we have. Roles within your family or your housemates, or maybe you don't live with anyone. Your relationships within various communities that you belong to. And I want you to avoid your thinking of role as vocation here. I'm talking about relational roles. Now, you may have relational roles within your vocation, within the job that you inhabit. But if you bring them into this second section, just make sure you don't you keep a distinction between your role at work or the role that you have as it relates to your career, and the role you have in your relationships. So yeah, and then another. Let's see. The other thing I might point out here is you may want to explore here is in your relationships. Do you have a healthy level of detachment, a sense of identity that is self-consistent from one community to the next? Or do you tend to adapt to whatever community you're a part of? Do you just become the expectation of the people you're with? Or do you bring a certain presence of being and selfhood into the relationships that you inhabit? It's important to be honest with yourself when you think about that. Because then, as you think about that, especially since what we're looking at is how to be agents of change, cultural change in this world, it's going to be very difficult to make any changes in this world if you have no resolve, no presence, no consistent selfhood, that a kind of internal consistency that you take from home to work to communities to church. And if you, on the other hand, or rather, are just a kind of product of your environment, the goal is to become is to make our environment a product of our presence, and not let our presence to become a product of our environment. We become the cultural pressure outside of ourselves, rather than allowing the cultural pressure to determine us or influence us. It's a general. This is my son, Kezek. Say hi, Kez.
Hi.
Okay, my oldest son, Kezek. I'm recording a lecture right now. Okay. So here, go have a seat on this chair right here, and I'll be done in. Here, I'll be done in just a minute. No, it's all right. It'll last, because I'm almost done, okay? Okay, all right. Okay. then last one, know where you are. This was, so this is, oh, okay, yeah. So I sent you this. Hey, you're gonna have to turn that down, buddy. Thanks. I sent you this. This is the seven spheres of influence chart, and this is kind of where now we want to think about making an influence and making an impact, being agents of change, cultural change, and we're looking at it in a different way than what would be typical, because we're thinking of cultural change within our sphere, however big that sphere may or may not be. Because the important thing, as I said toward the end of this, is that the goal is not to change the world, but to change the world we actually inhabit. So we want to think, where are we actually situated? So I have you identify the 3 spheres in which you are most self-consciously situated. That's the key word, self-consciously situated, from the most stable to the least. So like I said, so for me, I am most self-consciously situated in the sphere of family. Now, as I mentioned in the instructions, I've always been close to my family of origin, but once I moved out of the house and went away for schooling, missionary stuff, while in some way those related to my deepest relationships, and I would have described it in that way in the second section of this exercise, I was no longer in the family sphere as a self-consciously situated within the family sphere in the way that I'm talking about it. I was, in the first place, would have been in the religious sphere, number one, at that time, because I moved away and went to a missionary training school called YWAM. Some of you will have heard of it. And so I'd have been in the religious sphere, and then it would have been the sphere of education after that, because I was learning and I was teaching. I was part of the missionary training stuff that I was doing, and then I went out and taught pastors in Uganda for a long time. So that's where those are the 2 main spheres I inhabited, and then in the third place it probably would have been celebration, which I actually include there's overlap in religion and the arts for me, but I won't go into that now. But that's where I'm just giving you an example of how I would have seen myself and been self-consciously situated, so that's what I'm looking for now. So it's a way of seeing where you think of yourself as inhabiting. Now again, we're connected to all of these spheres ultimately, but where are you situated? And that's kind of the key word. And then that's the end of the first essay. And by the end, you should have a real sense of the world that you see yourself as inhabiting, situated. Then the second one is you begin by just a little 100-word, and like I said, it may seem weird, but you want to self-consciously identify where you're not situated significantly. And the reason why that's important is because, again, I think that our culture tends to want us to care about so many things that are located outside of a sphere where we're actually able to make a difference in this world. And so we need to just name, actually, I'm pretty far away from this sphere. I think this happens a lot with Christians, with pastors, or with vocational ministers. They get maybe frustrated or feel like like they're not able to make much of a difference as Christian leaders, and maybe they're not making much of a difference as Christian leaders. And so they project that frustration and become, Facebook prophets and complain about everything and the government this, the government that, and it becomes this kind of way of compensating for a lack of actually being able to lead. And the goal we need to have personally is to be able to lead out as witnesses for Christ in the world that we actually inhabit. So name where you don't where you're not situated, because that should determine, in my mind, what you focus your efforts on. I'd say to my staff all the time, we are in a process now, since I've been here in January, of eliminating and delimiting our efforts. We want to have fewer and more focused efforts, because we can all agree it would be great if we could pray for everybody all the time, if we could feed every starving person on earth, if we could take every opportunity that comes our way to make an impact for the kingdom. But if we try to do that, we will make zero impact. There comes a saturation point where it's the point of diminishing returns, rather, where you begin to overextend, thin yourself out. And I want to be about a few things and be about them with all that we are. So for us, it means we're going to do one thing called discipleship, and everything will either reinforce that or we won't do it. And so that's kind of the approach we're taking as a church. But I'm leading the way in that because that's the sphere that I inhabit. So so that leads to the major part of this project then, is to identify, now that you've identified your vantage point and delimitations, now consider what you can do to contribute to the sphere of influence that you inhabit in day-to-day life. And I mentioned referencing Smith's, consulting with Smith's formation, misformation, counterformation, liturgies, and secular and Christian. I thought that was particularly helpful, and I'll come back to that. And then also thick and thin practices. Again, I'll come back to that. And then implementing influence. Oh, I also included that basically the last essay with Hunter, that is a wealth of resources. It has a wealth of resources as it relates to things you can actually do to implement change in the world that you inhabit. Now, let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Smith talks about developing liturgies and so forth. Let me give you an example. A few things that I did, and I make a distinction between regularly or habitually and decisively. There are certain things that changes that need to be made decisively, whether you're in an organization or in a church or whatever, that have to stop. One of the things in the church that we're in was the governing model that we used, which was, and this is, we're getting into kind of philosophy of ministry here, so a lot of people could potentially disagree, but we function under a congregational governing model in our church. And one of the first things that I did was to, in consultation with our district, was to implement policy governance, which is it moves the power, as it were, from the congregation to the leadership and a governing board. And there are a number of reasons for that. This is one of the decisive changes that I'm talking about. It's it's been one of the best things for this church. Here's a couple of reasons for that. Number one, democracy doesn't work in a church. It just doesn't. I was raised in a Quaker church, and I realized very, very early on what happens when you have this purely democratic governing model. Again, you may disagree with me here, and that's absolutely fine. And you can argue that. You can talk about how one of the decisive changes that you could make as a pastor is moving to a congregational governing model. More power to you. I'm just giving you kind of the rationale for changes that I've made and an example. What happens is you have people who are really invested in the church, who are really informed about the church, who are really wise, and those people are willing to invest the time to understand, to pray, to meet together, to lead, and so forth. Those are the kind of people that are great to have, like in a governing board, for example. But in every organization, in every community, there will be people who are not well differentiated. This is now appealing to kind of family systems. It's if I could recommend an author to you, Edwin Friedman, who's written Generation to Generation. It's a book on congregational leadership, but he's also written Failure of Nerve, best book on leadership I've ever read, Failure of Nerve. But there are people who are not differentiated from the community, and they have no internal kind of nucleus, no internal selfhood, no sense of who they are apart from the community. And those types of people can be threatened by leadership because it threatens the homeostasis of the community. This is kind of what Friedman talks about. Well, and that's one type of person, just the person who's resistant to change. Then there will be people who are compulsively fearful or compulsively anxious. They're afraid of change simply because they're people. They are afraid people. They're fearful people. And so if a church is wanting to take a risk or move forward or anything, or organization, which is always necessary to move forward into anything, those types of people will be resistant to that, and their contribution will typically be negative. Thirdly, whenever you have kind of pure democracy in an organization or in a church or whatever, every time you vote on anything, it becomes an opportunity for division. For example, one of the things that the board did once they had agreed on, they had officially hired me, and then after they had a vote to bring me on, I had come and candidated and everything, and I encouraged them. I said, "Listen, I'm in no way threatened by this. I felt pretty confident about it, but I just want you to know, once they have this vote, here's what it will do. If anyone votes against me coming, and I come anyway because I won the majority vote, that person will feel." Maybe they believe God told them to vote against me, or so forth. That person is going to feel like they're not a part of what is happening moving forward. Now, thankfully, it was unanimous. The whole congregation voted me in, and thank God for that. But I just said from now on, we're moving to this model policy governance where the people vote on people, not on issues. And that's the beauty of it. What the people vote on is who's in the board, because that's what they do have an informed vote on. Not that every member's ignorant, it's just that they will have a much more informed vote on who is trustworthy and who can be looked up to in this congregation for leadership. And then the board, they vote in the board annually, and then the board, and then I'm accountable to the board. And the board has a specific role. Their role is to be negative, but a negative force of leadership within the church. And what I mean by that is they basically set the limits on what I cannot do, what I can and cannot do. So I, as a pastor, and then my staff as leaders, our job is to move forward, is to create, is to cast vision, to move people forward, to lead in that way. And the board basically keeps me from doing anything stupid, keeps me from running this thing off into the ditch. They create the delimitations as it relates to my leadership, but they're not under policy governance. They can't attempt to speak into the vision. That's what the leadership is for. So it's a way of establishing order. That's just one way. That's just one example of how to create a decisive change in, and this is my context. I don't know what your context may be. Decisive change that helps me to make a bigger impact. One, it actually raises the accountability by having wise people that the whole congregation trusts telling me what I can't do within the policy governance model, keeping me in check with the budget, instituting regular evaluations, which a lot of times in congregational settings you don't have that because everyone's in charge and then no one's accountable to anybody because everybody's a leader. It's a real sloppy, in my opinion, system. And idealistic. It's always appealing to the unity of the spirits. Just in my experience, the spirit seems to be a little bit schizophrenic in those situations, in those bodies, in my experience. And then, okay, that's enough about that. That was a little bit of a tangent. Now, some things that I implemented as part of the kind of liturgy, in my case, an actual liturgy because I'm a pastor. But I gave simple suggestions to you, starting prayer in the morning, whether your work, what office, your family devotions, whatever, bringing donuts to the office. It doesn't have to be spiritual necessarily. It's a way of creating these kind of practices that gain meaning over time. If you did it once, it wouldn't be that meaningful. But once you do it over time, it builds into the memory of people. And it becomes a kind of collective memory, and it becomes meaningful, and it gives a sense of usness, a sense of this is a community we belong to. I'll give you an example. One of the first things I did was I instituted a new tradition here. It's called Bless the Children Sunday. And once a month, we have the kids come in, from babies, nursery school, elementary school. It's a big logistical nightmare, and there are a lot of people who weren't super happy about it, but now everybody loves it because we bring them all in at the end of a service once a month, and the whole congregation stretches out their hands, lays hands on the kids. They're with their parents, and so everybody's laying hands on everybody, and we recite the Aaronic blessing over them. It's the same prayer I pray over my boys and my daughter now every night. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. And we do this now once a month. And this is becoming a thick practice, to use Smith's phrase. And I can't tell you how many people said that they've used this word to describe what it means to this congregation: healing. And what I didn't realize was that one of the habits of this congregation was to exclude the children. In fact, one of the things the first service I had here, first service here was a Christmas Eve service. And they said, well, so we're going to get childcare, right? And I said, what do you mean childcare? It's a Christmas Eve service. The kids are going to be in there. Oh, this is something that we've never done here. I'm like, on Christmas Eve, you're not having the kids in there? Who is this service for, right? This is where we pass the tradition along. And so I had the kids come in, and I made it in the announcement. I said, I know this is new, and to have the kids in here, and if you've got kids and they're being a big distraction, I just want you to know you belong. You are welcome here. We don't have a God who came into a sanitary synagogue. He was made flesh in the muck and the mire of it all, and he was born in a barn, laid in a manger. This idea that Jesus doesn't come into our artificial, sanitized incubators of life. He comes into the mess of it. He was made sin, who knew no sin, so that in him we can become the righteousness of God. This has been the value that I've been trying to instill in this body. But the real way to instill it was to get them to embody it. So I instituted this practice, this habit, this liturgy of doing this once a month. And now we are, as a congregation, embodying this value. We value the next generation, and we're going to bless the next generation. And it's been a beautiful thing. And I've done a number of things like that. Change the way we do communion to make it more of a gospel proclamation event, which is what Paul describes it as. As often as we do eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. And so I moved I made a decisive change. It's become a regular or habitual change in that we've become an open table congregation. That doesn't mean everybody's invited even if they don't have faith in Jesus. It means every Sunday that we do communion, when I consecrate the elements, I say, if you're a Christian, the table's open for you, yada yada yada. If you're not a believer and you've never taken communion, I want you to know that the communion event is not separate from the gospel event. This is all a means of proclamation of the gospel, proclaiming the gospel. And then I explain what Paul says. In doing this, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. So I want to give you an opportunity to respond to the gospel even now. If you've never responded to the gospel, I want you to know you are welcome to come to this table as a first response to the gospel. So, hey, I'm recording a lecture. Yeah. So this has become something that we do regularly, and it's becoming a thick thick practice, as it were. So those are just a few examples. It's a way of knowing the sphere that I'm inhabiting, and trying to implement change in the small little sphere that God has given me to be a human being, to inhabit this world. And as I said, I do that prayer over my kids every night. One of the things we do at the dinner table every night is we sing doxology, don't we, Keswick? What do you want to sing that song for this class? Probably not. Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Sorry, he's a little camera shy. So, and I'm not a good singer, so we'll spare you. But it's something that it's just something I just thought this would be a rich thing. Why not just do it every night before meal? And kids love singing anyway. So we sing the doxology, and then I'll say a prayer beyond that, and then we eat. Praying before meals, that would be just another example. Maybe you do it as a family. A lot of Christian families do, but a lot of Christian families don't even pray before a meal. But these habits, these regular practices, this is how we embody what we value and how we change the worlds that we inhabit. So hope that gives you some more concrete examples. So have fun with it. You'll get a good grade on it as long as you try your best and you think creatively but realistically. So go for it.